Well, today, Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer has a new estimate on how much revenue the federal price on carbon will bring in and how much consumers might see returned to them. Today's report looked at the four provinces now subject to Ottawa's new fuel charge: Manitoba, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. And with me now to discuss the numbers is Yves, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Welcome back, and thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
So you did release a separate report today on solitary confinement and prison costs, and we will get to that later. But I do want to begin with what you looked at on carbon pricing and cost estimates. What did you find in terms of how much revenue this program is going to bring in for the federal government?
Well, we found that what the revenues that will be generated by the carbon pricing at the federal level will be slightly higher than what the government initially anticipated at the end of 2018. And we attribute that to maybe small methodological differences as well as more recent data, but also to the fact that we have included the output-based pricing system, which will apply to large emitters. That being said, it's not a significant amount, the output-based pricing system. So roughly speaking, we're in the same ballpark as what the government estimated.
So you've got a bit of variation in the numbers based on geography and based on income levels. So let's start with the differences that we might see based on the four provinces, because obviously there's a bit of a wide difference in population, in size, in the amount of emissions that are taking place. What did you find in terms of what the average household in those four provinces are going to see?
Well, what we found is that the average household will pay the most in Saskatchewan and the least in New Brunswick and Manitoba. And the reason why Saskatchewan tops the league of the four provinces is because most of the electricity generated in Saskatchewan is generated using fossil fuels, whereas in the other provinces, it's less carbon intensive when it comes to power generation. For example, Ontario relies more on nuclear power, same with New Brunswick, whereas Manitoba relies more on hydro. So that's the main reason explaining the differences across provinces.
So anyone who's filling up their gas tank in one of these four provinces are obviously subject to that tax. It doesn't matter how much money you make, what your personal wealth is, what kind of vehicle you're driving. In terms of the rebate money that people can expect coming back from Ottawa on the assumption that the government is returning it to them, what did you find in terms of personal wealth, in terms of household income? How is that going to change what people might see? We
looked at consumption patterns of households, of average households, by income quintile. So we divided all households in 5 equal segments based on their incomes. And we found that for most households, once we consider the direct costs, like filling up the gas tank as well as heating oil and stuff like that, and the indirect costs, the costs that all the goods and services will embed the carbon pricing. So when we take that into consideration, as well as the federal rebate in each of these four provinces, we find that most households will see a net benefit. That is, they will receive more from the government than what they pay in carbon tax or carbon pricing, whatever the name you want to give it. The exception is those that are in the top quintile, so the 20% of Canadian households that make the most money. And you'll probably wonder, what's the top quintile? It varies from $111,000 in New Brunswick to $136,000, if I'm not mistaken, in Ontario and Saskatchewan. So people with a household pre-tax income above these thresholds are the ones that will be net contributors.
So as you're obviously aware, there's a major political debate going on in this country about this program. Yes. We've got court challenges. We've got a lot of vitriol going back and forth about the imposition of that federal backstop. Do these numbers that you've brought out and estimated, do they bolster the federal government's argument that their plan is not going to increase the cost of living for Canadians? Because that's obviously, it's an argument we've been hearing from the Ford government in Ontario especially.
Well, what this report shows is that Canadians will indeed pay more for fuel for heating their houses in the majority of cases, and will pay more for the price of goods and services. But what it shows, the report shows, is that on a net basis, once you take into consideration the rebate that the government will hand out to households and citizens in these 4 provinces, they'll be slightly better off on a net basis, again, except for those that are in the top quintile. That being said, there are huge variations across households. So even in the same income quintile, people with different lifestyles will be affected differently, because people will be getting the same rebate regardless of the type of household, of house or cars they drive, or if they drive a car at all, they'll get the same rebate, but they won't pay the same. So obviously, somebody who lives in a condo downtown Ottawa and walks to work will be a net beneficiary, but somebody who has to drive long distances and lives in a bigger house that's heated with gas or oil will pay more.
Well, let's turn from the cost of carbon and gas tanks to the cost of Canada's prison systems. That was the other report you looked at today, specifically Bill C-83, which is the government's plan to reform the solitary confinement process. Tell me what you looked at with that report and what you found in terms of the financing of that plan.
Well, we were asked by Senator Kim Pate to look at the cost of having structured intervention units as an alternative to solitary confinement, because Senator Pate wanted to have an idea of the cost of having what is called structured intervention units, which are special units to address the behaviors that drive inmates to be segregated and isolated. So what we found was that the cost would be slightly below $60 million per year to have structured intervention units whereby special employees or people with special skills in correctional services would address the violent behavior or the unruly behavior before individuals, inmates, have to be put in solitary confinement for their own protection and that of others, which is roughly consistent with the budget funding, not the budget, but the Fall Economic Statement funding allocated to Correctional Services Canada. In subsequent discussions, we also found out that Correctional Services is relatively well funded and could have absorbed these costs from internal reallocations without receiving any additional funding.
Okay, Yves Giroux, thanks so much for your time today. We'll talk again soon.
My pleasure.